Good afternoon. So if we go to Google and we type in experiments to determine mode of spread of influenza, here is what Google tells us. The first link is from the JAMA network. The second link is from Zenodo. This is a free way to read this article. At JAMA, they show us the first page, and then in order to see the entire thing, have to pay to read the 3 or 4 pages. And then there's the link to Harvard. I think we all know Harvard. And there can read a summary. And then the fourth link is the NIH, National Institute of Health. And so if we go ask Google, what is the JAMA network? And Google tells us that it's the Journal of the American Medical Association. It's a peer-reviewed medical journal published 48 times a year by the AMA. It's been around since 1883. So according to Google, this is a legit and reliable and appropriate source of medical information. And then if we go to Google and ask Google what the NIH is, it tells us the first result is the National Institute of Health, the nation's medical research agency supporting scientific studies that turn discovery into health. That's from the official government link. And then the next link is Wikipedia, and it says NIH is the primary agency of the United States government responsible for biomedical and public health research. So according to Google, NIH is a legit and reliable, viable source of medical information. So if we look up the name of the person who conducted this experiment, Milton J. Rosenau, I'm guessing that's correct pronunciation, and the first link is to Wikipedia, and it talks about him, it talks about his campaign to get rid of raw milk, but doesn't mention any of the experiments he did with the flu. If we look up Milton on the CDC website, it talks about food safety and his campaign to get rid of raw milk. No mention of his flu experiments. It says he was the director of the hygienic laboratory. Again, talks about his campaign to get rid of raw milk. No mention of his work and his experiments with the flu. So if we click on the JAMA network link, we're taken here and says, published August 2nd, 1919, experiments determine mode of spread of influenza. Tells us where it was done, island in Boston Harbor, volunteers obtained from the Navy. So we get the page, experiments performed at Boston, volunteers from the Navy, people who were involved, where they did it, Gallup Island. They figured these people were the most acceptable, mostly between 18 and 25, a few of them around 30. They were all in good physical condition. None of the volunteers, 100 all told, had had the flu before. So they were careful to try to weed out people who might have had the flu on the idea of natural immunity, and so they wanted people that hadn't been exposed before, and they were going to try to expose them to the flu and make them sick. At first, they proceeded rather cautiously because they were concerned about hurting people. They didn't want to make people sick or to kill people, and so they went cautiously at first, did mild exposure, and then that didn't work, and they kept upping the experiments trying to make people sick. As the preliminary trials proved negative, we became bolder. And then they selected 19 more. They kept doing more and more of the stuff, doing more exposure, doing everything they could to try to make these people sick. So that's where this free part of it ends. If we click the full text, it'll take us to a paywall link where we have to join. So if we click on the NIH link down here at the bottom, it takes us to the NIH website. And if we search for Rosenau, it takes us down here where we get a summary of what happened. And perhaps most interesting is the studies done from 18 to 19. They received a strain, by spray and swab, noses and throats, in the eyes. That failed to produce disease. And they isolated organisms from the noses and throats of the patients. That didn't work. Next, they injected blood. That didn't work. Finally, the volunteers were taken into the influenza ward, exposed to 10 different patients. They shook hands, they talked with close range, they coughed directly in their face. None of the volunteers developed the flu. Rosenau was clearly puzzled And then, the summary. We entered the outbreak with the notion that we knew the cause of disease, and we were quite sure we knew how it was transmitted from person to person. And at the end, they learned that they don't know about the disease. They're not quite sure what they know. And they continued at Angel Island in 1919, and it produced similar negative results. It seemed that what was acknowledged to be one of the most contagious of communicable diseases could not be transferred under experimental conditions. And if we click on the Harvard link, it takes us to the Harvard site. Same thing, a summary of what happened. And if we click on this Zenodo link, it takes us to the Zenodo website, and we're able to read the entire report for free. And it says they took what they estimated to be billions of the organisms and exposed the volunteers, but none of them took sick. Next, they proceeded to transfer virus obtained from cases of the disease. They collected material and mucus secretions in the mouth and nose and throat and bronchi from the cases of the disease, and they transferred it to the volunteers. The patient that they took it from had fever in bed, and there was a large, shallow tray in front of him or her. So they washed out the nose, and they ran the nose into the tray, nasal spray of these sick people. Then they gargled with the solution, and they spit that in the tray, and then they swabbed from mucus and coughing, and they put that in the tray, and they mixed that all together, and then they put that in a bottle and spray injected it into the volunteers. They received about 1 cc of this spray of snot and mucus and all kinds of nasty stuff, and none of them got sick. Then they took the same material they'd collected, filtered it, and distilled it into other volunteers, and produced no results either. Now he's thinking that perhaps the failure was due that they obtained the material in Boston, and by the time it took it to get to where the Gallup Island, it took 4 hours. So they're thinking that maybe the 4-hour time between taking the samples and putting them into the people was too long, and somehow the virus was very frail, and it died, or it couldn't be infectious in between that time. So they're like, okay, we're going to rush, get that time interval down to 1 hour and 40 minutes, thinking that that shorter time period would allow them to infect people. So they did the same thing in the nostril and the throat and the eye. 6 cc in all was used. Some of it was swallowed. None of them took sick. Now they're thinking that perhaps the time is crucial, that it has to be immediate, that the 1 hour and 40 minutes is too long. So they plan another experiment. So they do it direct. They got rid of the time and the salt solution, any outside influences. So in this experiment, they took little cotton swabs on the end of sticks, and they transferred the material directly from nose to nose and from throat to throat. So 19 volunteers during the time of the outbreak, many donors. Few of the donors were in the first day of the disease, others were in the second or third day. None of these volunteers who received the material thus directly transferred from cases took sick in any way. When I say none of them took sick in any way, I mean that after receiving the material, they were then isolated on Gallup Island. Their temperature was taken 3 times a day, and they were carefully examined and under constant medical supervision. They were held for 1 full week. None of them got sick. All the volunteers received at least 2, and some of them 3 of these shots, the snot stuff that they took from the sick people. The next, they tried blood injections. They took blood, 20 cc's from the sick people, and then pumped 10 cc's of the blood into the volunteers. None of them took sick in any way. They collected some mucus material and filtered it through a Mandler filter. They were thinking they would hold back bacteria of ordinary size and thus allow ultra-microscopic organisms to pass. So at the time, this is pre-electron microscope, not, there wasn't like virology per se. So they thought that there was maybe some smaller object or organism that they couldn't see or detect, and that was what made people sick. So they thought by filtering back the bigger stuff, that the really infectious stuff would get through and allow these people to get sick. And so they did 3.5 cc's of that. None of them took sick in any way. So the next experiment was designed to imitate the natural way in which influenza spreads, or at least the way they believe influenza spreads. And this guy, Rosenau, he says, I have no doubt it does, by human contact. So he does the experiment. He brings 10 of the volunteers into the Naval Hospital, into a ward having 30 beds, all filled with influenza. So here's what they did. The volunteer was led up to the bedside of the patient. He was introduced. He sat down alongside of the bed of the patient. They shook hands, and by instructions, he got as close as he conveniently could, and they talked for 5 minutes. At the end of the 5 minutes, the patient breathed out as hard as he could while the volunteer, muzzle to muzzle, in accordance with the instructions, about 2 inches between. So these people, the patient, the sick person, and the volunteer are 2 inches apart. And one is breathing out, the sick person's breathing out as hard as they can, while the volunteer, the healthy person, is breathing in as hard as they could. They repeated this 5 times, and they did it fairly faithfully in almost all the instances. After they had done this for 5 times, the patient coughed directly into the face of the volunteer, face to face, 5 different times. And they say the volunteers are perfectly splendid about carrying out the technique of these experiments. They did it with high idealism. They were inspired with the thought that they might help others. So after the volunteer had the exposure, the talking, the handshake, the coughing in the face, the breathing in, they moved on to the next patient. So they went from patient, sick person to sick person to sick person, being exposed to 10 different sick people. And each volunteer did that. They're hoping it would expose the volunteers to 10 different cases of the flu in different stages of the disease, mostly fresh cases, none of them more than 3 days old. We will remember that each one of the 10 volunteers had that sort of intimate contact with each one of the 10 different influenza patients. They were watched carefully for 7 days, and none of them took sick in any way. So at this point, he's exhausted, and he's like, oh man, we can't make these people sick. Let's take a break. And so they took a break, and that's what the other story talked about, that they tried it again, and they were unable to do it. Dr. McCoy with Dr. Ritchie, they did a similar series of experiments on Goat Island in San Francisco. Again, they tried to use volunteers who, as far as they know, had not been exposed to the outbreak. So no chance of any kind of natural immunity or building up any kind of resistance to the thing. And they all had negative results. They were unable to reproduce the disease. Then here they're starting to wonder, perhaps there are factors or a factor in the transmission of influenza that we do not know. And again, the conclusion, as a matter of fact, we entered the outbreak with the notion that we knew the cause of the disease, and we are quite sure we knew how it was transmitted from person to person. Perhaps if we have learned anything, it is that we are not quite sure what we know about the disease. I tried looking for like debunk, like I searched Google, debunk this, debunk the Milton guy, debunk the name of the thing, debunk that, and I couldn't find anyone refuting this experiment, either saying it didn't happen or it was fraudulent or that it was since repeated and they proved it wrong. And all that's said about it is that now it's unethical to repeat this experiment. And for me, I'm like, well, if we're talking about, millions of people dying, shouldn't we know? I would love to see these experiments repeated. And so we can see how germ theory works, how contagion works. Is it the way the theory says, or is there something else involved? I would love to know. Seems to me it's easy enough to repeat these experiments and do the double-blind, peer-reviewed studies and find out for sure. Let's know. That would be amazing for me. I think it'd be awesome to know the truth. What is the cause? I want to keep myself safe and everybody I love safe. So knowing for sure what does or doesn't, or how diseases work, or what makes us sick, I want to know. And so my hope is that by repeating this kind of stuff or sharing this kind of information that we can get to truth and fact and knowing what works, what doesn't, what makes people sick, what doesn't, what is health, how do we stay healthy, just knowledge, education, power, and everyone being healthy and everyone sharing what works and being able to make the world a better place, a healthier people, and coming together and being able to say for sure how to take care of each other. That's what I want, to be able to take care of myself, the people I love, my family, friends, neighbors, everyone in the community. Let's get together and take care of each other. And so that's why I'm sharing this, because when I saw this, I was stunned, and I was like, wow, I thought I'd been told and learned a completely different idea. And so I'd like to know for sure, let's find out, let's search for the truth together, and together we can find out what does work and take care of each other. Yeah, so thanks for watching. If you like this, if it's helpful, please, like, share, subscribe, spread it around. Hopefully this will stay up, and Google and Facebook and whatnot will be okay with me sharing this information. If not, if it is censored, then please look for, in the description, the link. There'll be links to other places, whether it's Rumble or Odyssey or wherever I'm allowed to share this uncensored. I hope that you can find it there too. And if you want to support me, support what I'm doing, support the sharing of this, come to my website, check out a membership or donate if you can, or any way you can support. I really appreciate it, and thanks so much.